In the heart of Texas, where shadows stretch long and the night air holds its breath, there lies an old, creaking bridge known as Langham Creek Bridge. The locals whisper about it in hushed tones, especially when the sun dips below the horizon and the darkness swallows the landscape whole. According to the legend, those who dare to visit Langham Creek Bridge on Patterson Road after midnight and turn off their car lights are met with an eerie, spectral phenomenon. They say that if you wait in the pitch-black silence, you'll soon hear faint, rhythmic tapping on your car windows. Some say it's the ghost of a tormented soul, trapped between worlds, desperately seeking help. Others believe it to be the restless spirit of a tragic accident victim, whose blood still stains the bridge's timbers. One night, a group of friends, Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah, decided to put the legend to the test. Armed with skepticism and a thirst for a thrill, they drove out to the infamous bridge. The road was deserted, the night unusually still, and an unsettling chill hung in the air. "Come on, it's just a story," Mark said, his voice trying to sound confident. "We're going to debunk this myth once and for all." They parked the car in the middle of the bridge, its wooden planks groaning under the weight. With a nod from Mark, Emily switched off the engine, plunging them into an oppressive darkness. The only sound was the distant croaking of frogs and the gentle rustling of leaves. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Sarah, sitting in the back seat, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced nervously at Jake, who was staring intently into the night, his face pale and tense. Suddenly, a faint tapping sound echoed through the car. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but grew louder with each passing second. The friends exchanged panicked glances, their earlier bravado quickly fading. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the car was enveloped in a thick, swirling fog. It came from nowhere, obscuring their view and chilling the air. The tapping grew more insistent, more desperate. Tap, tap, tap. Mark, now visibly shaken, reached for the ignition. "Enough of this. We're leaving." He turned the key, but the engine sputtered and died. Panic set in as the fog pressed closer, tendrils of mist creeping through the cracks in the windows. The tapping had become a frantic pounding, echoing through the car like a heartbeat. Desperation took hold. Jake grabbed his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Emily frantically pressed the horn, but it only emitted a weak, pitiful sound. They were trapped. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to recede, the tapping ceased, and the night returned to its unnerving stillness. The engine roared to life, startling them all. Without a word, Mark floored the gas pedal, and they sped off the bridge, hearts racing and minds reeling from what they'd just experienced. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of their town, the bridge a distant, haunting memory. In the days that followed, the friends struggled to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a trick of the mind, a mass hallucination brought on by their fear? Or had they truly encountered something otherworldly on Langham Creek Bridge? Mark found himself waking in the dead of night, heart pounding as he remembered the tapping. Emily avoided dark roads and bridges altogether. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something malevolent. And Sarah, the most skeptical of them all, found herself glancing over her shoulder, haunted by the ghostly fog and the unanswered questions that lingered in its wake. Little did they know, their encounter was only the beginning. The ghost of Langham Creek Bridge was far from done with them. The days turned into weeks, but the fear never left them. Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah went about their lives, but the shadow of that night loomed over them. The memory of the fog, the tapping, and the sheer terror seemed to cling to their very souls. They had escaped the bridge, but they hadn't escaped the ghost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark received a strange call. The voice on the other end was raspy and filled with static. "Return to the bridge," it said, "or face the consequences." The call ended abruptly, leaving Mark with a chill that ran down his spine. He immediately called his friends. "We need to talk," he said, his voice urgent. They gathered at Mark's house, each one looking more haggard than the last. "I got a call," Mark began, recounting the strange message. "Someone or something wants us back at the bridge." "That's insane," Jake said, his voice rising. "Why would we go back there?" "Because," Sarah interjected, "maybe it's the only way to find out what really happened and put an end to it." Emily nodded reluctantly. "We can't live in fear forever," If we don't face this, it might haunt us for the rest of our lives. Despite their trepidation, they agreed to return to Langham Creek Bridge. They gathered supplies, flashlights, cameras, a first aid kit, and even a voice recorder in hopes of capturing evidence. As they approached the bridge, the familiar chill of fear settled over them. The night was eerily calm, the moon casting long shadows over the bridge. They parked the car at the edge and stepped out, their footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. Mark took a deep breath. Let's do this. They walked to the center of the bridge, and Mark set up the voice recorder on the hood of the car. Emily turned off the headlights, plunging them into darkness once more. The silence was deafening, each heartbeat thunderous in their ears. Minutes passed, stretching into an agonizing eternity. Then, it began. The tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if someone or something was knocking from the other side of the veil, trying to reach them. Who are you? Mark called out, his voice steady despite his fear. What do you want? The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The air grew thick, and the fog began to roll in again, swirling around their feet. Sarah clutched her flashlight, its beam cutting through the mist. Show yourself, she demanded, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the fog coalesced into a shape, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of the bridge. Its form was indistinct, but the eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pierce through their very souls. Emily gasped, taking a step back. What do you want from us? The figure raised a hand, pointing towards the far end of the bridge. A whisper, carried on the wind, reached their ears. Find her? Find who? Jake shouted, his voice echoing in the mist. The figure began to dissolve, the fog dissipating with it. But the sense of urgency remained. They needed to find whoever or whatever the spirit was pointing them to. The ghost had given them a mission, and ignoring it could bring even more dire consequences. With renewed determination, they decided to investigate the history of Langham Creek Bridge. They pored over old newspapers, scoured local archives, and interviewed longtime residents. The more they dug, the more they uncovered a tragic story. Decades ago, a young woman named Clara had disappeared on the bridge. She was last seen walking home one foggy night, but she never made it. Her body was never found, and her disappearance remained a chilling mystery. The friends realized that Clara's restless spirit might be the one haunting the bridge, seeking justice or closure. They had to find out what happened to her and why she was trapped between worlds. Their search led them to an old, abandoned house near the creek. It was said to be the home of a reclusive man who had lived there during the time of Clara's disappearance. The house, now dilapidated and overgrown with vines, held the secrets of that fateful night. As they approached the house, a sense of foreboding washed over them. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. In the corner of the living room, they found a small, dusty box. Inside, wrapped in faded newspaper, was a locket with Clara's picture and a diary, its pages yellowed with age. They carefully opened the diary, the faint scent of old paper filling the air. Clara's last entries were filled with fear. She wrote about a man who had been following her, watching her every move. She feared for her life, and her last entry ended abruptly. As they read the final words, the temperature in the room dropped, and the tapping began again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was closer, louder, coming from the walls around them. We need to leave, Emily whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. But as they turned to go, the ghostly figure of Clara appeared before them. She looked just as she had in the photograph, young, terrified, and pleading for help. Please, she whispered, her voice echoing in their minds, help me find peace. In that moment, they knew what they had to do. They needed to confront the man who had caused her so much fear. The legend of Langham Creek Bridge was no longer just a story, it was a call for justice, and they were the ones chosen to deliver it. With Clara's spirit guiding them, they ventured deeper into the house, each step bringing them closer to the truth. The air grew colder, the tapping more frantic, as if the very walls were alive with the echoes of the past. Little did they know, they were not alone. The spirit of the man who had haunted Clara's final days was still there, lurking in the shadows, bound to the house by his own malevolent deeds. The friends were about to uncover a truth more horrifying than they could have ever imagined. The night was far from over, and the bridge between the living and the dead was about to reveal its darkest secrets. The atmosphere inside the abandoned house was thick with anticipation and dread. Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah could feel the weight of Clara's tragedy pressing down on them. As they ventured further into the house, Clara's spirit seemed to guide their steps, leading them to a heavy, old wooden door in the basement. The door creaked open to reveal a dark, narrow staircase. Each step felt like a descent into another world, the air growing colder and more oppressive. They reached the bottom and found themselves in a small, dimly lit room filled with dusty old furniture and forgotten relics of the past. In the corner of the room, they spotted an old trunk, its surface covered in cobwebs. Clara's spirit appeared again, her eyes pleading and filled with sorrow. Mark knelt down and carefully opened the trunk. Inside, they found a collection of letters, photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. Emily picked up the journal and began to read aloud. It belonged to the reclusive man, Edward Harper, who had lived in the house during the time of Clara's disappearance. The journal detailed his growing obsession with Clara, his increasingly erratic behavior, and his desperate attempts to keep her close. He was in love with her, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. But it wasn't love, it was possession. He couldn't stand the thought of her being with anyone else. The final entries in the journal were chilling. Edward wrote about his plans to confront Clara on the bridge, to finally make her his. The last entry was dated the night she disappeared. That must be when he took her, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. He must have brought her here. Sarah, her eyes wide with fear, pointed to a small door in the corner of the room. There's something behind that door. They cautiously approached the door, its handle cold and rusted. Mark took a deep breath and pushed it open. The stench of decay hit them immediately. Inside, they found a small, hidden room. The walls were lined with old, yellowed newspapers detailing Clara's disappearance and other local mysteries. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar, covered with candles and faded photographs of Clara. On the floor, they found a weathered skeleton, its bones twisted in a grotesque position. Clara's spirit appeared again, standing over her own remains, her face a mask of sorrow and relief. "We found her," Emily said softly, tears streaming down her face. "We found Clara." As they stood in silent reverence, the temperature in the room began to rise, and the air grew heavy with a sense of impending doom. The ghostly figure of Edward Harper materialized, his eyes filled with madness and rage. He lunged at them, his spirit radiating a dark, malevolent energy. Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah were thrown back, their flashlights scattering across the room. The spectral form of Edward advanced, his presence suffocating and relentless. Clara's spirit stepped between them, her form glowing with a soft, ethereal light. "Leave them be," she commanded, her voice strong and unwavering. "You have tormented me long enough. It's time for this to end." Edward's spirit recoiled, his rage turning to fear as Clara's light grew brighter. The room shook, the very foundations of the house trembling under the force of the spectral confrontation. Clara's light enveloped Edward, his form dissolving into the air like mist under the morning sun. As the last remnants of Edward's spirit faded, the house fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warmer. Clara turned to them, her expression one of gratitude and peace. "Thank you," she whispered. "I can finally rest now." Her form began to fade, the light growing dimmer until she was gone. The friends stood in stunned silence, the reality of what they had just witnessed slowly sinking in. "We need to get out of here," Mark finally said, his voice shaking. "We need to tell someone about this." They carefully gathered the journal, letters, and photographs, hoping they would provide the evidence needed to finally solve Clara's case. As they made their way back up the stairs, the house seemed less threatening, as if the spirits that had haunted it were now at peace. The drive back to town was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. They knew they had a long night ahead of them, explaining everything to the authorities and coming to terms with their experience. But they also knew they had done something important. They had helped a restless spirit find peace and brought a tragic story to light. As they drove over Langham Creek Bridge one last time, the fog began to lift, revealing the stars above. The tapping was gone, replaced by the serene sounds of the night. They had faced their fears and emerged stronger for it. Yet, as they returned to their lives, they couldn't shake the feeling that their journey wasn't entirely over. They had uncovered one mystery, but how many more lay hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to seek them out? The legend of Langham Creek Bridge would live on, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. And for Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah, The night they faced the ghost was only the beginning of their adventures into the unknown. As the friends drove back to town, a heavy silence hung in the air. The gravity of what they had uncovered weighed on them, but there was also a flicker of hope that they had finally laid Clara's spirit to rest. They reached the local police station, exhausted but determined to report their findings. Mark handed over the journal and the photographs to Officer Daniels, a seasoned officer who had heard countless stories about Langham Creek Bridge. "You've done the right thing," Officer Daniels said, his expression serious. "We'll investigate this further." Relieved, the friends returned to their homes, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy again. But as days turned into weeks, something dark and sinister began to unravel. Each of them started experiencing strange occurrences. Mark would wake up at night to the sound of tapping on his windows, only to find nothing there. Emily began seeing fleeting shadows in her home, cold spots that would appear without warning. Jake found eerie, cryptic messages scrawled on his bathroom mirror in a foggy script after every shower. And Sarah felt an icy hand brush against her skin, always just out of sight. They gathered again, this time at Sarah's house, their faces pale and drawn. "It's happening again," Mark said, his voice tinged with fear. "Whatever we did, it didn't end there. We need to go back," Emily suggested, though her voice was shaky. "Maybe we missed something," they reluctantly agreed. As night fell, they made their way back to Langham Creek Bridge, the sense of dread growing with each passing mile. The bridge loomed ahead, bathed in an unnatural fog. They parked the car and stepped out, their breaths visible in the cold night air. Suddenly, the fog thickened, and the tapping returned, more insistent and angry. Tap, tap, tap. They turned to see Clara's ghost, but this time, she wasn't alone. Edward's malevolent spirit hovered behind her, his eyes burning with rage. "You shouldn't have come back," Clara whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "I cannot protect you now." Edward lunged at them, his spectral form twisting and warping with anger. Mark and Jake were thrown against the car, their heads striking the metal with sickening thuds. Emily and Sarah screamed, trying to run, but the fog ensnared them, cold tendrils wrapping around their limbs. "You brought this upon yourselves," Edward's voice echoed, filled with malice. "You will suffer as I did." The friends struggled, their cries lost in the swirling fog. Edward's spirit bore down on them, his hatred palpable. Clara's ghost watched, helpless and weeping, as Edward's rage consumed them one by one. Mark's vision blurred, the world spinning as he tried to crawl away. He saw Emily's lifeless form lying nearby, her eyes wide with terror. Jake's screams faded into gurgles as the fog choked him. Sarah's struggles grew weaker, her body slowly succumbing to the cold grip of the otherworldly force. With his last breath, Mark looked up to see Clara's sorrowful gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her form flickering like a dying flame. "I'm so sorry." Darkness closed in, and the night fell silent once more. When the morning sun rose, Langham Creek Bridge stood quietly, shrouded in mist. The car was gone, and no trace of the friends remained. The legend of the bloodthirsty ghost continued to grow, fed by the disappearance of Mark, Emily, Jake, and Sarah. The bridge became a place of fear, where only the bravest or the most foolish dared to venture after dark. The tapping would still be heard on quiet nights, and the fog would roll in without warning, a chilling reminder of the spirits that haunted Langham Creek Bridge. The friends had uncovered a tragic story, but in doing so, they had become part of it. Their fates were sealed, their spirits forever bound to the bridge, a cautionary tale for those who sought to challenge the unknown. The thin veil between the living and the dead had claimed them, and their cries for help would forever echo in the darkness.